The Bowness Hippodrome is probably one of, if not the most significant cinema building in Scotland in terms of its both rarity and its age. It's thought to be, as far as is known, the oldest surviving purpose-built cinema building in Scotland.
I think it was probably on my year out from college when I was working for Bill Caddell. I came down to the building at that stage and it was pretty appalling internally, but even then you could see that this was a real jewel in the centre of town and you had to do something with it.
The public in Bowness have always had a great deal of love for cinema, and when the Hippodrome closed there was a huge gap left in Bowness.
The growth of cinema as a purpose, as its own building type, separate from theatres or other premises where films had generally been shown up until that point, very much came about due to the piece of legislation called the Cinematograph Act, which was brought in to try and tighten up legislation about the showing of films after various problems with fires, with lack of escape routes in different cinemas.
I think the design of the Hippodrome is something that, a bit of curiosity to me. I've looked quite hard to try and find examples of similar types of buildings, and while you can find references which relate to round auditoriums or the type of entertainment that was put on, and perhaps to a certain extent to what was happening externally, the bringing together of them all in a cinema building is really particularly unusual and works fantastically well.
Cinemas are quite interesting as a building type, particularly in Scotland, because most of Scotland's theatres were built by English architects, whereas most of Scotland's cinemas were built by local Scottish architects, which is different from in England, where many of them were built by big chains like Odeon, ABC and so on. In Scotland, they were almost always built by local architects.
The Hippodrome was built in 1911, 1912, to designs by Matt Steele, who was a local architect. He worked almost exclusively, not quite, but almost exclusively in Bowness, and did a number of the fine buildings in the town that survive now.
Louis Dixon first of all commissioned the building from the architect. So he came along, he'd already been screening films, and he went to Matt Steele and said, I want to build a picture palace.
It's a very unusual design for a cinema building because the auditorium is round, which isn't how you'd normally think to design a cinema. And because of that, and the fact it's called a hippodrome, which is a word more associated with theatres than cinemas, it was often thought that perhaps it was originally designed to be for theatrical use or touring theatre rather than being cinema. But when you look at the original plans in the archives, which miraculously still actually exist, the plans are titled Proposed Picture Palace for Bowness, so it's quite clear it was always designed to be a cinema. And the plans also had details of a projection room, and also quite nicely a note to say that the toilets were to be added later, which thankfully has actually been done.
I think that Louis Dixon had a background and had a reputation even later in life as being a bit of an impresario. He liked to promote other types of entertainment. He liked to get people in to show their talent and to actually do other things. His interest was very, very largely in film, but it wasn't exclusively.
To build something like this must have been a huge leap of faith in 1910. I don't know how much it cost, but it would be, he must have made money somewhere to be able to do it.
The first manager of the Hippodrome was Louis Dixon, and he was a local man, and he was not only interested in showing films, he was also making films at the same time, small local topicals, recorded at local fairs and so on every year. And these had the great advantage of having lots of local people in them that you could then advertise as showing them at your cinema, and the local people would come to see themselves on the big screen. So it was a canny commercial exercise as well as a great record of what was going on in the town at the time, and really helped to make the cinema the heart of the local community.
There were a number of proposals for using the building, and they ranged from, I'll not say the loopy, but they ranged from things like a waltzing waters display through to a gymnasium, and there were several others as well. Cinema use was at the top of the list of priorities, but it was the one that seemed least viable because cinema operators weren't interested in taking the building on. And we did approach a number of cinema operators at the time. We carried out a feasibility study for the uses of the building and looked at options. Cinema was one of the very strong ones, and it's the obvious one that would enable the building to stay the way it was, largely.
I think there was a great anticipation in Bowness around the reopening of the Hippodrome. People came to see the building before it was refurbished, while it was being refurbished. Everyone was talking about it, and everyone you speak to in Bowness has a tale to tell about the Hippodrome. And there's this great love for the building. the community has.
Well, when we first moved in with the building, the contractor started day one on site. The building was in pretty appalling condition. The roof was in very poor condition, and particularly around the perimeters of the drum, where there are a number of flat and shallow pitched roofs that allowed water to come in, and there was dry rot running extensively through a lot of the building fabric. There'd also been a fire on the stage or just off the stage. And the contractor's first step was to start trying to identify what was on site that could be salvaged. And he set aside an area in his compound and 2 containers in which we took anything that we felt was of value or was actually interesting and from the original fabric and could be saved into those containers to be sorted out and identified later. So there was a very gentle strip out rather than moving in with a chainsaw and a skip.
Local people would walk past this building as it was before and think, why doesn't somebody do something with this? You know, it's falling apart. And it was. And there was a huge upsurge in interest as soon as it became known that finally, after 30 years, something was being done with the building.
There was a period of 2 weeks when we had archaeologists within the building carrying out investigations under the floor level, where the removals had revealed the remains of the street pattern in Bowness, which had been in the town prior to the formation of Hope Street to the west of the Hippodrome. And at the back of the building there was a small cobbled area and the footings of some earlier buildings discovered.
The romanticism of the old projectionist job is a bit of a myth. And in fact, it wasn't romantic at all. It was hot and uncomfortable and dirty, and noisy, long hours for not very much money. But the guys who did it loved it.
We consolidated the floor and built a new floor in the auditorium off which all the rest of the work could be carried out. So it gave a working platform effectively. It was a level floor because at the early stages of the project we had retained flexibility and an option that the seating would be removable and that the floor would maybe be used for tables, standing rooms, this kind of thing, rather than the raked seating that's in the building at the moment. Once the floor was completed, the interior of the building was scaffolded right the way from that new floor up to the underside of the roof structure, and the work then started on the repair of the roof, while the external repairs to the roof were ongoing as well. The conical section of the roof over the auditorium drum was stripped of its roof finish, which was basically just felt sheeting, and a new copper roof was inserted in its place on a new timber deck. Beneath that, and working from the scaffold internally, the roof build-up was consolidated first of all, and then increased by the insertion of thermal insulation, which is also acoustic insulation, and then further acoustic boarding internally, so that the new linings are all new acoustic linings, very heavy weight, in order to try and reduce the amount of noise leakage from the building, the noise being generated by the new cinema sound systems. And then eventually the finish was put back on, and internally on the roof structure we've put back an acoustic plaster finish, which hopefully will again reduce the noise leakage and also hopefully reduce the reverberation times within the auditorium drum, because we were concerned that the Hippodrome was built at a time when there was no sound system. In fact, there was no sound with film at all, and it was live music, and its reverberation is great for live music but pretty lousy for modern surround sound systems.
What we have in the Hippodrome is state-of-the-art modern cinema equipment in a historic building. And the remit of the technical side of things was to put in the best quality and the most versatile cinema equipment we could get. Here we can do silent, we can do sound in the older fashion, we can do the CinemaScope formats, the widescreen formats. We've got 2 types of projector. We can run film in the quotes, unquotes, old-fashioned way, proper film on wheels. And alongside that, we've got the modern, fully digital projector, which isn't half as interesting because it's a black box with a computer attached, whereas with the film machine you can actually see the wheels turning.
While all the work on the outside was going on, the replacement of the roof and the re-rendering, because the render on the building had taken a rather sorry state by the time the works commenced and was largely, as we found, patched over the years. We took off a lot of the very poor patches, consolidated it all and re-rendered. Internally, we also worked on the balcony. The balcony seating was removed and taken away to a furniture repair company who reupholstered the majority of the balcony seating. Meanwhile, the section of the balcony in the centre was taken apart and reconstructed with one less step than it had previously. So there's one fewer row of seating on the balcony than there was previously, and that enabled us to increase the legroom on the balcony seats and also to insert new balcony seating in the central section, because the indication was that people coming to the cinema, although they would look to see the character of the old building, would be looking more for seats that were comparable with those that they might find in a more contemporary cinema. The auditorium on the ground floor, once the floor was in, we added in 2 extra new buildings which are at the back of the auditorium, one functioning as a booth selling sweeties and also a bar at one end, and the other accommodating disabled toilets, which the building was sadly lacking previously.
There's a great deal of enthusiasm about getting it right and making sure it's as good as it can be, which you may not get in many other places. We have the luxury of being able to do that, so we've only got one screen. We're not having to run around looking after 10 screens, half of which might be out of focus, but we don't know it. So we enjoy the fact that we're able to do that, and technically it's as good as we'll get anyway.
We also constructed a new pitched deck on the ground floor of the building, which wasn't part of the original plans, but eventually the advice was necessary in order to accommodate the quality of seating that we required. And a central section was formed underneath the balcony to accommodate all of the seating in the ground floor.
You see families coming in and they'll go and get the popcorn or whatever, and they say, yeah, can we go upstairs? It's great, you know, and there's this air of enthusiasm, of wonder about them, which I suppose historically it's what cinemas were about, was the wonder. And this, it feels very different from the impersonal, commercial nature of cinema as most children will see it these days.
When the building was taken to bits at the outset of the building, which a lot of the material had been stored on site, and towards the end of the contract we started to take things out of storage, it was catalogued by the Scottish Historic Buildings Trust. They brought in some students to carry out an almost archaeological catalogue of everything from doorknobs to toilet signs and toilet fittings. We went through that and identified what we felt could be reused and then refurbished where possible. Things like the radiators, the door handles, a lot of them were re-chromed or they were retained as they were. Most of the fittings in the building that we could save, we did save, and there was very little of it found itself in a skip at the end of the day.
It's interesting seeing the Hippodrome reopen as a cinema. It seems that this seems to be happening quite a lot in Scotland recently, as small communities taking ownership of their cinemas and fighting to reopen them.
Falkirk Council were extremely instrumental in getting the Hippodrome project ultimately to come to what it is now. And if it hadn't been for them stepping in, then I think it may well have been the case that the Hippodrome was still languishing in dereliction. And for a council to actually take the bold step of taking on a building of this type and form is really quite something. I have to take my hat off to them. I don't know any other council that would be quite so bold in doing that.
You come here, the staff will welcome you at the door in best cinema tradition. The manager is at the door. The front house staff will speak to you and direct you and answer any questions. And it's a very much more personal experience. It's a more intimate experience. And the building itself, when you walk into it, is warm, and it feels, I don't know quite how you would describe it, but it has an atmosphere about it which you don't get in modern cinemas.